The honourable member for Dufferin-Caledon. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I actually can't believe that I'm back here today to speak about this motion. I think I spoke to this motion maybe 3+ weeks ago, could have been 4 weeks ago. And at the time in that speech, what I said was, and I just want to reiterate, this was 3+, maybe 4 weeks ago, all of this could end if the government simply released the documents. And they have stubbornly refused to do so. And they have the only reason that I can come up with is this. You know, in my background as a lawyer, and I see there's only one reason to hide something, right? The reason you're going to hide something is because it's so bad. It's so damning that clogging up the House of Commons so that no other work gets done is actually the preferable option. So you have to think about that for a minute. They could have released the documents 3.5, 4 weeks ago and got on with their so-called agenda. Now, I think it's a terrible agenda, and I think it's brought us to where we are as a country, where rent has doubled, housing prices have doubled, 1 in 4 Canadian parents are skipping meals for their children, 2 million people going to food banks. We think it's a terrible agenda, as do most Canadians. But the Liberals the NDP Liberals, I mean, they're in a coalition, they're not, I can't keep track. The NDP keeps voting confidence in them, so I guess they're still in an agreement, but maybe they're not because the NDP leader ripped it up but keeps voting support. So I don't know, but I digress. The NDP Liberal government has an agenda that they think is working. I mean, objectively it's not, but they think it is. So their decision has been, we're not going to bring forward our agenda at all because we won't release these documents. So any reasonable person has to say to themselves and ask themselves this very simple question. Why are they working so hard to hide these documents? And a reasonable person, any person, will have to come to the same conclusion that we have. These documents are so damning. They're such an indictment of this government and the minister in charge that they will move heaven and earth not to release the documents. It is legitimately the only thing that you can be left with. And this is a scandal-plagued government. We know that. We've had a minister recently resign for a raft of scandals. He took off out of here under a cloud of scandals. And let me tell you, this will be worse. And it's across the entire breadth and scope of this government. We just heard today about, from the Auditor General, the CEBA business loans. $3.5 billion to 77,000 recipients who weren't eligible. Now, might be some NDP Liberals over there saying, what's that got to do with this? Well, because that's exactly what happened at SDTC, right? A whole bunch of Liberal insiders got money with a process that was not the normal process. It was just a printing press for Liberal insiders. And now we've looked at the CEBA business loans, and we're finding the same thing. So again, this is why they try and hide and cover up everything, because they know the truth is so damning to A, their incompetence, and B, their corruption. What's even worse about what the Auditor General revealed today is that this whole CEBA loans, they were administered by a censure in a non-competitive process. So the government just gave them the contracts. They gave them $313 million out of the $342 million worth of contracts awarded. And guess what? Most of the work they did was done in Brazil. It didn't even benefit Canadians. You'd think a Canadian program that's being managed by a Canadian company would actually be administered by Canadians. Makes little sense to me. Doesn't make sense to these guys because literally nothing they do makes sense. So these kinds of scandals, it's kind of a strange place we're in right now here in Canada. because every week there's a new scandal that should bring down a government. It's become so commonplace for these Liberals to be caught with their fingers in the cookie jar that, it's hard to shock people. But Canadians should be shocked with how they've behaved with respect to these contracts. And just to reiterate, the Auditor General found in the Green Slush Fund that 82% of the contracts were awarded inappropriately. Now, that's an A-. I mean, when I was in school, if I got an A-, I'd be pretty excited. So, they've got an A- in corruption. And I suspect if they keep working hard at it like they are, they could get that grade up to an A or an A+ before the next election, something that they can be really proud of. Get that A- in corruption up to an A+. That's probably what they're working forward and working hard on. Now, again, to say, why are we pressing so hard for these documents? Well, because we know these documents are going to be so bad for this government that we have said we will keep debating this issue until they produce them. Now, here I'm going to read a few quotes from some of the whistleblowers on this case so that Canadians who are watching can understand exactly why we're working so hard to get these documents produced. Here's what one of the whistleblowers said. The true failure of the situation stands at the feet of our current government. That's the NDP Liberal government, the people over there, whose decision to protect wrongdoers and cover up over the last 12 months is a serious indictment of how our democratic systems and institutions are being corrupted by political interference. Listen to that for a second. This is from a brave whistleblower, took the risk to expose the corruption, and the words that are used are incredibly powerful and damning of how our democratic systems and institutions are being corrupted by political interference. And then goes on to say, it should never take 2 years for the issues to reach this point, and what should have been a straightforward process turned into a bureaucratic nightmare that allowed SDTC to continue wasting millions of dollars and abusing countless employees over the last year. Now, if you had a government that was not corrupt, someone would have been held accountable. I remember a time when there was this thing called ministerial accountability. Ministers who were found to have engaged in egregious conduct had the honor to resign. And what's happened here? The absolute opposite has happened. What's happened at SDTC is an ongoing, unfolding scandal. A scandal, according to one whistleblower, that is an indictment of our democratic systems, and our institutions are being corrupted by political influence. All to award juicy, big, fat contracts from Liberal insiders to Liberal businesses from a program that was supposed to be monitored by a Liberal minister. So there's two things that could have happened here, Madam Speaker. The first one is the minister is absolutely incompetent. Okay, so fire that incompetent minister, right? A minister who allowed this to take place is de facto incompetent. It's their department, they're responsible. There's this thing called ministerial responsibility. If you're an incompetent minister and you allow a raft of corruption to take place, corruption so much that it threatens our democratic systems and our institutions, well, that minister is incompetent and should have resigned. And if the minister didn't have the honor to resign, they should have been fired. Okay, that's scenario number one. Scenario number two, which is a little bit darker, is that the minister actually knew the corruption was going on and taking place and decided to do nothing. So you have to ask yourself the question, we're 4 weeks into demanding the release of the documents. Their entire political agenda has ground to a halt as a result of this. So think about the two options that I just presented. Was it that the minister was incompetent, so they're trying to protect incompetence? Yeah, I just kind of don't think so. Scenario two is the real scenario. That there was widespread corruption, corruption that the minister had to have been aware of and turned a blind eye to, just like the whistleblower said. And that is why they will fight tooth and nail not to release the documents, because it will show how systematic and systemic the corruption in this program was, and that it reached the highest levels of this government. Therefore, they will not release these documents under any circumstances. And that is the sad but accurate state of affairs with this NDP Liberal government. Now, I want to talk about another whistleblower, because what these NDP Liberals keep saying is, oh, there's no criminality, the Auditor General didn't find any criminality. And that's true. I mean, it's one of the very few accurate statements we get. But here's what another whistleblower said about this. Just as I was always confident that the Auditor General would confirm the financial mismanagement at SDTC, I remain equally confident that the RCMP will substantiate the criminal activities that occurred within the organization. Criminal activities. This is an SDTC whistleblower saying that they are confident that the RCMP will find criminal wrongdoing. So let's go back to the scenarios that I was just talking about before. We've got two possible scenarios here on why they're not releasing the documents. Scenario one, as I said, we have a completely incompetent minister who allowed a whole bunch of bad apples to run rampant through this program, doling out cash, making it rain for all of their Liberal insiders and buddies. That's scenario number one. Or scenario number two is we have widespread corruption that would make the sponsorship scandal, remember that? The sponsorship scandal that brought to the end of the previous Liberal government? You know, people stuffing money in little bags all going around the place. They tried to deny that as well, if we all recall. They said, oh, there's nothing to see here. Well, there was a lot to see. So the second scenario, again, with what this whistleblower is saying, is that there was criminality. Okay, so if there was criminality, why do they want to hide the documents? We have to keep asking this question. This whistleblower is saying, I am equally confident there will be criminality found. So why would this person say that? Because they obviously witnessed the criminality. Now, criminality could have been the criminality of the people at the department. That may well very have been the case. But if that was the case, why wouldn't they just release the documents? Because they don't have absolute control over the people that work there. The only reason why they'd be hiding documents that likely have criminality involved is because the criminality just keeps moving up the food chain to people who knew. And that is the reason why they are refusing to release these documents, and why they've paralyzed this Parliament for the last 4 weeks in their absolute obstinance to release the documents. They are so desperate to cover this up that they might have this go on for the next 15 months. Because why? They know the documents will bring an end to their government. They're that damning. It's the only explanation that you can do. So, again, they said there was no criminality. That's one of their defenses to this. Then they've said there's no criminal intent. That's the other one. Well, it's interesting because there's a whistleblower that talked about criminal intent. Imagine that. And this is what this whistleblower said. I know the federal government, like the minister, has continued saying that there was no criminal intent and nothing was found. But I think the committee would agree that they're not to be trusted on this situation. Sometimes you get real pearls of wisdom from people who come forward and make statements on this. I think the committee would agree that they're not to be trusted on this situation. So what this Liberal government is asking Canadians to do is to trust them on these documents. We've produced documents and we've redacted 90% of what's in the documents, or 80%, whatever it is. Just trust us. There's nothing damning in these redactments. It's just standard procedure. I think what we've learned from these NDP Liberals is they absolutely cannot be trusted with these kinds of documents. Remember what we heard way back in the day with respect to Jody Wilson-Raybould? The story in the Globe and Mail is false. Does everyone remember that? That's what the Prime Minister said. And then remarkably, the story was actually true. So when we look at whether or not they should be trusted on this, I think there's no one. Well, there might be a few, hardcore Liberal supporters in downtown Toronto that still want to trust them. But anywhere else in the country, let me tell you, the trust with these guys is at zero, as it should be. The whistleblower goes on to say, I would happily agree to whatever findings the RCMP would find, but I wouldn't trust that there isn't criminality unless the RCMP fully investigates. So again, another whistleblower saying we can't trust them, we think there's criminality here, and the RCMP should investigate for criminality. So we go back to asking ourselves the question, why won't they release the documents? And the reason why, and I know I've said this several times, but I think it is really important to hit this point home. The reason why they won't release the documents, despite 4 weeks of Parliament, 4+ weeks of not getting their agenda through Parliament, is because they know, right? They just know. They know that the degree of criminality that's going to be found in these documents, they know how damning it's going to be for their government. And let me phrase this in a way that everyone can understand. So this is a government that's been mired in scandals for the past 2 years. So they're not new to scandal, right? It's not something new or shocking. So you'd think at a certain point they'd be like, well, another scandal, it's no big deal. We'll just get those documents out. It'll blow over in a couple of weeks, right? But they don't. They're still here obstructing Parliament and not producing the documents. So it goes back to the fact that this is not your everyday run-of-the-mill scandal. It's really sad, actually, when you have to say that phrase. It's not your everyday run-of-the-mill scandal by a government. That's actually how many scandals and how corrupt this government has been proven to be that we get to use that phrase. But it's not a run-of-the-mill scandal. Or they just release the documents. They do what they normally do. They would do like a Friday evening document dump. We all know it. That's when the government takes out the trash. They put something out at 5 p.m. on a Friday, usually a long weekend like Thanksgiving or the August long weekend, because they know Canadians are paying attention. But guess what? They didn't even do a document dump on this. Again, why? Because they know what's in these documents will bring about the end of this government. Now, we know there's going to be an end. When we have a carbon tax election, which is coming, that will be the end for them. And they just want to desperately hold on as long as they can. The NDP wants to hold on as long as they can because their leader needs his pension. So we know that's why they keep propping up the Liberals at every opportunity. They say they ripped up the agreement, but they prop them up. So we know this government's unfortunately going to keep going. And that if they release these documents, it would actually be the end. Even the NDP wouldn't be able to prop them up anymore because the documents are so bad, which is why they're not releasing the documents. And it's why we are where we are today. And it brings no joy to me to be here speaking about this another time. They've made this choice. And the conflicts that go on in this program are really unbelievable. So we've got another minister now mired in scandal. So first of all, we've got the minister who was responsible for SDTC, who we've conclusively come to the conclusion either incompetent or involved in this scheme. Or now we also have the Minister of the Environment, who was a strategic advisor for Cycle Capital Management. And oh, guess what? Cycle Capital Management got a whole bunch of money from the Green Slush Fund. Now, I wonder how that happened. I wonder why, given that, they don't want to release the documents. Because they've got at least 2 ministers who we know will be very badly exposed from the documents. I will end this with this. This has gone on long enough. All they have to do, it's very simple, release the unredacted documents, and we can get back to the business of the House. Thank you, Madam Speaker.